Hello, friends. If you weren't able to gather with us this past Sunday, know that we missed you. We hope that you are well. Thank you to everyone who helped out this past Saturday with our church workday. We accomplished a lot, so thank you. Really appreciate it. Today, we are finishing our series, The Parables of Jesus. We have not covered every single parable of Jesus, but we've looked at 25 of Jesus' different parables. And so today we're going to be concluding that series. And next Sunday is an open worship Sunday. Hope you can make it for that. And then in November, we will be starting a series on the fruit of the Spirit. So I'm excited for that. Now, it's fitting that we are ending this series on the parables of Jesus by looking at what appears to be the very last parable that Jesus ever told to his disciples. They were privately gathered around him on the Mount of Olives. Today we're looking at the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now we're going to jump in. We're going to read the parable in just a moment, but first, I have a question to ask you. And here's the question: sheep or goat? Take a look at the picture, study it, and make up your mind. Is that a picture of a sheep, or is that a picture of a goat? Have you decided? This is an Awasi fat-tailed sheep. When we hear Jesus talking about sheep, this is the picture. It's the sheep of ancient Palestine. Now, of course, we hear the word sheep and we imagine a white, fluffy creature that looks very different from a goat. But in ancient Palestine, sheep and goats grazed together. They were both valuable animals. Wool, meat, cheese, milk, wineskins. But sheep, they were notorious for devastating pastures because they didn't just eat the grass, they stayed and they they ate the roots of the grass. And goats, on the other hand, they were notorious for devastating the shrubs and the leaves and the trees and the fruit orchards, and that's kind of where they gravitated. But when the shepherds put the sheep and the goats together, then the goats weren't really interested in the roots so much, and they kind of kept the flock moving along. And the sheep, they weren't really that interested in the trees, and so they kind of kept the flock moving along, and it helped. It worked out. And so every evening, the shepherds, they would bring their herd to the courtyard for safety. And in the evening, it was sorting time. The goats, they had long hair. Perhaps even some of them, there was some curl to it, but the coat was not as thick, and the goats were not as hardy as the sheep. So the shepherd needed to bring the goats inside. The shepherd needed to bring the goats under some kind of a shelter so that they could weather the night cold. Now the sheep, on the other hand, that they were a bit woolier, a bit warmer, and so they could sleep outside. They could just sleep in the courtyard. And so sorting the sheep and the goats, it was a trick, and it required an experienced eye. It required expert judgment. A shepherd had to know his animals because they were quite difficult to tell apart. Many of them were black and brown with patches and generally dark. And so you had to know what you were doing. Okay, so now let's read our parable. Matthew 25:31 through 46. Jesus said, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. He will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous, the just, will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me." And then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" And he will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous, the just, to eternal life. For a last parable, that is a powerful parable. That that story has that parable has impacted my life for a very long time. It's an important one. It depicts a core part of our ancient faith, which is judgment is postponed until the end of history. And the good news is that Jesus is the judge. And just like every other parable about the final judgment, like you've got the parable of the weeds and the wheat, or the parable of the fish caught in the net, they all show us this picture where judgment is not a task that is left up to us. And also this really interesting picture of the results will be surprising. Like both the sheep and the goats in this story seem a little bit perplexed. Jesus is talking to them and they're like, "What? What? When did that happen? You say that happened when? Oh, that was you?" And you'll notice that the sheep and the goats, they look very similar in this parable. They say almost the exact same thing to Jesus. They both call Jesus, the king in this parable, they both call him Lord. The nations, that's this picture of everyone, they are separated based on their compassionate care, their compassionate action toward the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the foreigner, the naked, the sick, the prisoner. Now, in the ancient Middle East, those descriptive words, they were the description of the folks who were really considered as good as dead. Uh, this is the picture of the people who it's like they have no hope. Life has become so miserable for them that it's not even worth calling it life. Now, What is Jesus looking for in this story? I want to suggest wholeheartedly that the answer is love. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of the conversation Jesus is having on this day with his disciples, if you look at Matthew 24:12, he's that's a part he's saying this is about love. But we say, what is love? That's a word that means a lot of things. Imagine a man. He is sitting alone in a bar. It's 4 p.m. On the bar in front of him are many shot glasses, many bottles. He's having another one right now, and he is an alcoholic. Now, his family, his wife, his children, they are back at home, and his kids are just desperate to have a dad in their life, desperate for his attention and his care. And his wife is desperate to have a partner in life and a lover, someone who's by her side. Now, the man in the bar, the tears are streaming down his face, and he's sobbing to the bartender. And he says, "Oh, I just love my family so much." And he finishes this one and he says, "Can I have another one?" Now, I don't mean to throw the alcoholic under the bus. He is doing something that is just common to humanity. Renowned psychiatrist Scott Peck points this out. He uses this picture and says, love is not a feeling. Love is an action. Now, we all have this common tendency to confuse the actions of love with the feelings of love. That story I just told you, it just illustrates it. Uh, but this happens all over the place. And when we confuse the actions of love and the feelings of love, it can result in all kinds of self-deception. It can result in us telling ourselves, I really love that person. And so in this parable that Jesus is sharing, we see the king, we see God doing the same thing that God has been doing all throughout history, which is distinguishing between people who actually love God and people who feel like they love God. And so throughout Scripture, God identifies with the poor, with the oppressed, with the disadvantaged in such a way that it's like whatever we do for the poor, the oppressed, the disadvantaged, it functions as a mirror of what we do to God. Uh, Go back to Proverbs 19, verse 17 says, whoever is kind to the poor, they are lending to the Lord. So see if you can notice the difference between the actions of loving God and the folks who feel like they love God in these examples down throughout history, down through Scripture. So Isaiah, he calls the people of Israel pagans because they are not correcting oppression. Orphans are not rescued, widows are not defended, there is no justice. And God says, I really don't care how good your religious festivals are. I don't care how many burnt offerings you offer. I don't care about your worship songs. God says, I despise your fasting because at the same time that you're fasting, you guys are active and complicit in the oppression of vulnerable people. The prophet Jeremiah says you cannot separate caring for the poor from knowing God. Amos, the prophet Amos, God says that religious festivals and songs are actually making him sick, making God sick, because this this worship of God is getting mixed up with oppression of the poor. The Apostle John in the New Testament says that if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or a sister in need but has no pity on them, he asks, how can the love of God even be in that person? And so history's full of examples of people who really do feel like they love God, but their actions say something else. So I'll give you an extreme example, admittedly extreme. On the belt buckle of every soldier in Hitler's army was printed the phrase, God with us. In Hitler's book he wrote, Mein Kampf, he identifies himself as a Christian. So, I mean, that'll give you this jarring juxtaposition of someone who they feel like they love God. They really do feel like that, but their actions say otherwise. And it's not just Hitler's army. The world is full of people who feel like they love God. And yet all they really want is a comfortable life. And so it generates this thing where it's like, if I'm good, then it's all good. Uh, and I think that's an important line to recognize uh, when we're doing that. Well, if how are things? Well, if I'm good, it's all good. And so this is common to humanity. It's we don't see that sins of omission, which is omission is things you don't do, they can hurt the heart of God every bit as much as sins of commission, things that we do. And so, can you see this distinction between love as a feeling and love as an action? And can you see how much God identifies with the, the hungry and the thirsty and the stranger, the foreigner, the sick, the naked, the prisoner, the poor, the orphan, the widow? Scott Peck says, love is as love does. So, a discussion question for you. We discussed this within our gathering, and so I'd invite you to pause the video and discuss this with whoever you're gathered with. Have you ever identified yourself with a loved one so much so that when someone treated your loved one in an unloving way, it felt like those actions were being done to you? So tell the people you're with about it. Pause the video, have that conversation now. Okay, welcome back. I don't want to spend our whole time talking about hell, talking about eternal punishment, because that would be missing the main point of this parable of Jesus. However, this is also one of the parables that generates a fair amount of hell conversation for people. And so let's go there briefly. Brian Zahn says hell is the inability, and I would add hell is the refusal to love. So it's the inability or the refusal to love. C.S. Lewis says God takes our freedom so seriously that God will allow us to say no. God will allow us to not love Him, not love others, and He will allow that forever if that's what we're choosing. Now, to those who ignore the hungry, to those who ignore the foreigner, the thirsty, the naked, the sick, the prisoner, Jesus says these are the ones who go away into eternal punishment. But what is that? What do those words mean? We're going to look at these words just a little bit here. Eternal, it's aionios, and punishment, kolasin. Now, that first word, eternal, you can hear the root, which is eon, which is like this period of time. And that word, aionios, can be translated as everlasting in duration. So that's looking at the quantity. Like how long? Well, forever. So this punishment, this is the view that people say hell is you're burning forever. Okay. That word eternal, aionios, can also be translated as everlasting in effect. So that would be the quality, not the quantity, but the quality. And that would be this view that says you cease to exist. What is hell? It's that you say, I don't want you, God. And God says, very well. God removes his hand from you. You cease to exist. Or Ionios can be translated as answering the question of when. Rather than asking how long, it could be answering when. So it would be the judgment of the age to come. Now, that's that first word, but what about punishment? Um, so the Greek word is kolasin, and it's interesting to notice that this word punishment, it only shows up 2 times in the entire New Testament. And so it's worth looking at where else does it show up. And that would be 1 John 4:18, which says, there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with kolasin, which is punishment. And so you can find this word punishment used in 2 different ways through, throughout history. Um, so it could be an ancient deity punishing violators, and so that would be this meaning that is to restrain or to cut someone off. However, kolasin can also describe discipline in the sense of restorative correction. For the sake of bettering an offender. So, for instance, the Greek philosopher Aristotle said kolasin is corrective. It's this opportunity to amend and change. It's worth noting that there are 2 different Greek words that are both translated into our English Bible as the word punishment. So if you're asking the question like, does that word punishment only show up twice in our entire English Bible? And no, it doesn't. So there's this other word that means punishment, and that is timoreo. And that word is this picture of retribution. It's a picture of vengeance. Uh, remember Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the Apostle Paul? He describes himself doing to Christians punishment. It's before his conversion. He's taking them prisoners. He's taking them to Jerusalem to be punished. And so it's also interesting to ask, why does Jesus say, okay, the goats are going away into eternal punishment, but he doesn't use the word timoreo? So, what is this eternal punishment? Well, from the earliest Christian history, Christian leaders, the early church fathers and mothers did not agree. So you've got, just for example, influential theologians like Augustine says this eternal punishment is you're burning forever. Then you've got early church fathers like Justin Martyr. Ignatius of Antioch says, no, it would be closer to you're ceasing to exist. Then you've got Gregory of Nyssa, he's called the father of the church fathers, or the flower of orthodoxy, the great defender of the Nicene Creed. And he would say, no, this is the refiner's fire. This is the cleansing fire where evil is expelled. And so he would compare the pain of this fire to the doctor's knife that hurts like surgery, but with recovery of health as the goal. And all 3 of those views believe that salvation is through Christ alone. See, God's plan, it's important to notice in this passage, it was never to do this big human project where God gets to the end of the project. That's this picture in this parable. And God plans on dividing everyone up. And he's like, okay, we're going to go. You're going to the hellfire. You're going to the kingdom of God. You're going. See, that's never the plan. If you look at the parable, Jesus talks about the rewards for the sheep. This is verse 34. And he says, it's the kingdom of God prepared for the sheep from the foundation of the world. So these rewards are prepared from the very beginning. That's the plan. But notice that eternal fire, whatever's going on right there, it was not prepared for humans. Do you see that? It's verse 41. Jesus doesn't talk about the eternal fire as if it's prepared for humans. He says it's prepared for the devil and for his angels. So what is this eternal punishment? Well, that question obviously creates tension for people, and I've had plenty of people want me to relieve that tension for them. Like you're the pastor, tell me which one. Uh, I don't get to answer that question, and we don't get to answer that question in the end. Jesus gets to answer that question, and so I don't think it's for me to resolve that tension for you. Instead, we all get to live under this text, and the parables of Jesus, they don't always resolve everything. They're open-ended. They provoke possibilities and they invite us on a journey. And so we get to live towards Jesus with these stories that Jesus tells. All right. Uh, that's heavy material. So stand up and take a break. Uh, whatever you need to do, shake it out. Breathe in and swing your arms and do a twist and whatever you need to do, because we're going to move on and talk about love. So Jesus tells both the sheep and the goats the same thing, which is, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was a foreigner, I was naked, I was sick, I was a prisoner. And inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. And so for centuries, Christians have been asking this question, okay, who are the least of these brothers and sisters of Jesus? Um, some people would say, well, Jesus is talking about other Christians here. And so they argue our task as the church is not to try to make the world a better place. They say the church is just supposed to be the better place. And then others say, well, no, the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, that's literally anyone in need. They look at love your neighbor as yourself. And so they say, no, Christians should be making the world a better place. Well, there's a third perspective, and it's actually the perspective that I hold, which is why not both of them, a both and rather than an either or, and specifically in the order that you see them listed. First of all, to be the better place and to make the world a better place. The Apostle Paul seems to hold this same perspective, which is, he says, Galatians 6:10, as we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So the church is not meant to be this like ingrown club only for the sake of the church. That's while the rest of the world suffers. That's not what we're supposed to be. But it's as we become healthy, we're doing that for the sake of the whole world so that we can extend ourselves and reach out and get outside of ourselves and offer mercy and compassion. And it's the same picture as what God told Israel clear back in Genesis 12 when God is choosing Abraham. God says, I am choosing you for the sake of the entire world so that all the people of the earth will be blessed through you. Uh, It's interesting when people start arguing about this parable and say, well, who should we be helping and who should we be not helping? I just want to say, why don't you go find someone living in a tent and ask them who this parable is about? Why don't you ask an immigrant who this parable is about? Why don't you go to the hospital or prison and ask them what this parable is about? See what kind of answers that you get. Let's get real practical here. My capacity, your capacity to act in love is limited. Every day has only 24 hours, and we need to sleep 8. They tell us sleep's important, so we need to be sleeping 8 of those hours. So we only have so much time. We only have so much energy. We only have so much money and resources. And on top of that, we all have responsibilities and obligations and loved ones, and all of that is important. At the final judgment, Jesus, the picture is not Jesus asking, did you solve world hunger? Did you feed every person on every street corner? Did you solve the clean water crisis around the world? Did you open your home to every refugee, every immigrant, every person living in a tent, every elderly person needing care? Did you buy tennis shoes for every homeless person wearing tattered boots that you could see their toes? Did you make sure that every prisoner received a visit once a week? That Jesus isn't asking that because your capacity, my capacity to love is limited. And Jesus gets that. And so Jesus isn't asking if you gave compassionate care to everyone. Jesus is asking if you offered compassionate care to anyone, anyone who they didn't have anywhere else to turn. They they were vulnerable and they were falling through the cracks and you offered them care. What Jesus is looking for is, did you feed anyone who didn't have enough to eat? Uh, did you help anyone pay their water bill? Did you help any immigrant, any refugee from your local community who was trying to figure out life in a new place? Language, job, furniture, clothing, legal processes. When someone new showed up at church, when they were a stranger, did you invite them over for lunch? Did you open your home to anyone who was lonely? They didn't know where to turn. Do you know what it feels like to become a friend to someone who has no other friends? Like, have you ever had a friend who they're the person who they they have no network of support, and you say, "I'll be one of your friends." Uh, did did anyone ever receive clothing from you who really needed clothing? Do you know what it feels like to visit a prison, to go through the screening protocols, which involves a lot of fair amount of paperwork these days, and to finally sit across the glass from someone, you put your hand up on the glass, and they put their hand up, and maybe a phone or a little hole that you talk through, and you're listening, laughing, crying, sharing stories, just being with them for a moment. Do you know what that feels like? Jesus is asking not the everyone question, he's asking the anyone question. Uh, have you done this with anyone? People all around us are hurting in so many ways, and far too many people are trying to figure out how to sustain the bare minimum in life. Like this picture that Jesus is giving, it's the picture of like the most basic needs on the hierarchy of needs. Within our own church family, we have people who are trying to figure out some of the needs on this list. And then when we look at our community and around the world, so many people trying to figure this stuff out. And Jesus identifies with every single one of those people. In as much as you've done it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you've done it unto me. So he's asking, do you actively love me, or do you just feel, you feel like you love me? So this parable is offering us this beautiful gift, which has the potential to turn daily life moments into very holy experiences. It's when you look into the eyes of that stranger, that convict, that foreigner, that homeless person, that person with no friends, that mentally ill person, that elderly person, that sick person. It's like you're looking into the eyes of Jesus, and you have this moment, you have this opportunity to love Jesus. And of course, that calls us beyond ourselves, to extend ourselves. It calls us beyond my schedule and my program and my bottom line and my project and my house and my bank account and my hobbies and a life oriented all around me. It calls us to get out of our comfort zone and a different kind of motivation. It's not a motivation of fear, it's a motivation of love. If you're trying to live a life, if you say, yeah, but I just want to live, I just want it to all be good with me, I want to live in my comfort zone, I really don't know that it's possible to live the life of a sheep. I'm not sure it is, because love is other oriented. Love is self sacrifice. In as much as you've done it to one of the least of these, you have done it unto me. So, where do we end? Well, I'll speak personally. I look at this picture, this fat tailed Awasi sheep, this sheep that looks like a goat, and this picture of these sheep and goats, and they're mingled together, and Jesus is sorting them. And I look at my life and I realize that there's there's a part of me that acts or behaves more like a sheep. And there's a part of me that acts or behaves more like a goat. And I use this parable, and I think this is for all of us, to bring me to a deeper place of prayer, saying, Jesus, you are the good judge. I invite you to make me healthy and holy and whole and sanctify me and cleanse me and teach me and free me from what I would do on my own, which is I would try to live a comfortable life. I would try to feel like I love God and have zero contact with the vulnerable and the needy and the hurting. And so I end this saying, I see that I could go both ways here. Jesus, heal me, save me, free me to love you more. And so this final discussion question for you at home, what does it look like? What does it look like when you're living, acting, behaving like a goat? What does it look like when you're living, acting, behaving like a sheep? I think it's easy to assume, well, I'm a sheep. I'm good because whatever, you fill in the blank. But more importantly, am I living in that love that I claim to have for God? I'll end where Jesus began his whole ministry, which is part of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Love you, friends.